Okay, well, welcome to the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program's webinar, State of the Urban Forest. I'm Kate Four, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, a partnership between UVM Extension and the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I will be moderating the webinar this evening. Our presenter tonight is Rick Harper. Rick is with the UMASS Extension. He is the Assistant Professor of Urban and Community Forestry. He is an ISA board-certified Master Arborist and a Connecticut licensed arborist, and has over 15 years of combined green industry experience, both as a field technician and in Cornell University's Cooperative Extension Commercial Horticulture Program. Rick has received his Master's of Science in Entomology and undergraduate degree in Environmental Studies and Forest Management. We're very fortunate to have him join us tonight. So welcome, Rick, and I'll just go ahead and turn the mic over to you for tonight's presentation.
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you great.
Excellent. Okay, well, it's great to be here, and so we're going to go through a few slides tonight. I'm pretty informal, so if anybody does jump in and want to ask me questions, I'm more than happy to try to answer them. And also, of course, my email should be at the bottom of the screen, rharper@eco.umass.edu. I'm in the Department of Environmental Conservation, so I'd welcome any kind of comments or feedback or questions. So as we start to move forward here, this is actually kind of a quintessential shot here in New England. This is, of course, the forest whenever the leaf change is occurring. This is actually Gatineau Park, just north of the city of Ottawa in Canada, my hometown. And my point in sort of starting off with this slide is that basically when we look at the whole of the New England Northeast geography, we're in essence dealing with a temperate woodland. So what that in essence means is that it's a forested biome. So if you're to leave a parcel of land fallow, for the most part, in most areas, in most instances, it's going to revert to woodland. So basically, we do a great job of growing trees in the Northeast. And so when I talk to my friends and other folks that do things like manage turf and such, I'm always happy to say that they're generally doing an uphill battle, if you will, here in the Northeast, because we're not the prairie, we're not the plains, and we're certainly not the far north or above the tree line. We're a forested biome here. Now, forests, of course, were not always the preferred land cover. During the expansion period, as we see here from the mid-18 to the early 1900s, forests east of the Mississippi were really cleared at quite a radical rate. At over 13 square miles a day is one number that I came across. And that's pretty amazing when you think of the fact that the technology that people were working with century and a half ago was pretty limited. Everything was by hand and horse and drawn and such, as you can see in these pictures. So it's a pretty radical amount of wood to be clearing each day. And so the forest cover really fell east of the Mississippi from a majority of the landscape. 70% is one number that I came across to a minority of the landscape. Now, largely that happened because of utilitarian purposes, because we were very much an agrarian society living off the land. We needed open spaces. Sunlight was important for doing things like grazing animals, growing food, and all those things that we associate with sort of an agrarian type lifestyle. And the wood itself had a lot of utilitarian value. You think about all the lumber and the raw wood and wood products that would have been needed back then, especially given that you were heating with wood and that sort of thing. And of course, there was great concern related to human and wildlife conflicts, diseases and such that we really don't concern ourselves with on a regular basis. Think of things like rabies and such. That was very much a presence 150 years ago. And the access to medical care was very much limited back then as well. But if you actually take a look at pictures of cities back at that time, turn of the century or turn of the last century, I guess I should say, the idea of living in and around the woods really wasn't a very common concept. You actually see lots of pictures where streets are in essence barren, properties were barren, besides perhaps an occasional shade tree here or there. But many pictures throughout the New England, throughout the Northeast, show cities where the tree cover really wasn't what it was today. This is one old statistic that I was able to come across. This is from Oakland, California. And Oakland now features over 20% forest cover, but back in the 1850s, that was only 2% forest cover. So our cities and towns are very much more heavily forested now than they were back in, as I say, this expansion period, if you will. And we fast forward to sort of our current population trends, and we see a lot more people living a lot closer proximity to one another. Basically, now we have 80% of the U.S. population living in and around urbanization. If you look at the world's population, it's 50% of the world's population. My understanding is that, for what it's worth, in 2008, the United Nations declared Homo sapiens an urban animal. So, like I said, this trend toward moving out of the countryside and into cities has continued for quite some time, to the point to where we are here in the present time, where we basically have large population numbers, lots of people. We have to now, of course, have large numbers of mature trees, which of course are non-indigenous to the urban environment, and we're all in tight proximity to one another. So we're sort of living, as one of my former colleagues used to say, in somewhat of a modern day experiment. So when we start to look at this on sort of a state-by-state basis, we see here, of course, for us here in Massachusetts, the vast majority of the state now, when you compare it to what had happened back in the expansion era, where our forests were reduced to a minority of the landscape, a lot of that has rebounded to the point where we now have over half of our state being forested. But yet, as I said, our urban centers feature much more urban tree cover than they have in the past. You see here just one example here. Boston features 29% urban tree cover. Kate and I were talking a little bit earlier. It's about 10% higher or so up in Burlington. So the typical New England city features somewhere in the vicinity of about 30 to 35% urban tree cover. But yet we have a lot of people in most of our states. Vermont is a little bit of an exception to the rule. Only about 40% of folks living in Vermont live in urban communities, but in other states here, like in Massachusetts, Connecticut, over in New York, you're basically looking at a majority of the population, clear majority of the population living in and around urban centers. And you can see here, of course, that the same holds true in terms of forest cover in New York, where you have a majority of the state being forested and a lot of tree cover, significant amount of tree cover now in our urban centers. So basically, people like to look at something like this versus looking at something like this. This is probably not the preferential type of landscape that we like to view. So if you can indulge me for a bit here, one sort of anecdote that I like to start off with is, this is a picture of Westchester County. This is just north of New York City. And so as Kate had mentioned earlier, this is where I've worked for 12 years in the commercial horticulture program at Cornell University's extension program. And right around the center of the county, there's a town called Chappaqua. And of course, many of us have heard of Chappaqua. It's now famously the home of Bill and Hillary Clinton. And this is actually Taylor Road in Chappaqua. And Taylor Road is what we regularly used as a sort of a living laboratory, if you will. And if someone were to look at Taylor Road, they would say, well, what a beautiful viewscape. It's got lots of nice, as landscape designers like to say, sort of a visual interruption on either side of the road. Kind of creates a nice alley of trees. We're looking at basically Norway maples here. Kind of no surprise there. But any of us who are knowledgeable or enjoy learning about the structural health of trees, we can see that a lot of these trees don't look very healthy at all. And so we used to use this setting actually as a training site for arborists, and we worked a lot here with the utility folks, the line clearance inspectors, because we would talk a lot about proper pruning cuts and such with these sorts of trees. And you can actually see, of course, you can see some dead branches, you can see some seams and cracks along these trees. You can see, of course, the road is probably wider than it once was, probably wasn't always a paved road. So the health of these trees in terms of the structural integrity has very much declined over the years. And what you're essentially looking at here is an even-age stand of trees. You can probably see here on the right-hand side some plow injury. You can see some nice seams and cracks through these trees right here. So whenever we would go to this site, we would be on this road for probably anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, and someone would pull out with a law degree or some such background and wonder why we were there, and wonder if we're going to be clearing those trees down and tell us we better not clear these trees. But I was always happy to get off of this road because it really was truly a very risky situation. And if you think of things like school buses and other such vehicles using this road as sort of a thoroughfare where would connect to two more major roads. It really was a fairly well-trafficked road and pretty unsafe in terms of the trees that surrounded it. So my question was always, is Taylor Road the exception of the rule in terms of how people felt about those trees, the social perspectives, and also in terms of the forest health, those trees themselves? Is this really a microcosm of many of our communities here in the Northeast and across the country for that matter, or is it really more of an aberration, if you will? So it doesn't take us very long to look at the science and to look at the feedback from researchers, and basically we can conclude that people feel pretty strongly, pretty passionately about their community trees, about their green spaces, about their parks and such. And this is just one feedback from one study, one international study back in 2006, quoting the fact that people have a very high opinion of their residential and the community trees, that they feel that they're pleasing to the eye, and that they help to enhance the look of the garden and the home. Those are the top responses in this particular survey. And of course, we celebrate trees. You have National Arbor Day, you have National Tree Week over in the UK, that sort of thing. And what I'd like to sort of use this to sort of dovetail into is that this is a study that was put out by the Forest Service in early 2012. It's actually a fairly extensive study. It's in terms of looking at manuscripts, you're looking at a couple dozen pages, which is pretty large for a typical study. But this particular study looked at the urban health of our trees across the nation, and so they had a nice news release. And you can actually, if you just do input study nation's urban forests in a search engine, you'll get this particular page right here. So you can go right to the study yourself if you wanted to see that. But basically, when you start to delve into this, start to look at the overall urban health of our urban trees in the country, the structural integrity, the biological health of these particular of our urban trees. And at first, whenever I saw this particular study, I thought to myself, is this really an accurate title for the news release, Nation's Urban Forest Losing Ground? Because I think of a lot of excellent and exciting tree planting initiatives going on. You think of like Grow Boston Greener or Regreen Springfield's activities in Springfield, Massachusetts, or the Million Tree Campaign in New York City, and many others across the country. I say to myself, this really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But when you start to look at the numbers, we see that our urban tree cover is on the decline by 7,900 hectares a year. That's almost 20,000 acres a year nationwide. And when we look at that on a per tree basis, that's about 4 million trees per year that our communities are losing. So our city tree cover is actually forecast to continue to decline annually on a nationwide basis for the near future. And of course, we see a whole lot of other environmental things occurring as a result of that, such as impervious surface is going to be increasing, and that concerns us regarding stormwater runoff and those sorts of things. There's a lot of nice information in this particular study about the importance of using tools like iTree, and the study actually goes into identifying, which we're going to talk about tonight, some of these underlying causes that relate to explaining the health of our urban trees. And I sort of alluded to it a little bit earlier when we looked at a picture of Taylor Road, but basically our urban forests lack diversity, and they lack diversity in a couple key ways. And that word up in the top right-hand part of your slide, or the top part of your slide, aging, is really one important way. Our urban forests are aging. They're very much, as I said, an even age stand. And so we're dealing with a lot of trees that have become larger over the years and are started to mature and, of course, decline at basically around the same time. So here's just a few numbers that I was able to pull. 60% of New York State street trees, 60% of New York State street trees have a diameter of about 12 inches or more. So these are getting larger trees, with 2/3 of these trees actually being 18 inches in diameter or more, while only less than 1 in 5 of these trees, 18% of these street trees, are about 6 inches in diameter or less. So you don't have a lot of small trees. We have more medium and larger sized trees dominating the urban landscapes. In Connecticut, it's sort of the same type of deal. Over half, 51% of the street trees are 13 inches in diameter or more, with 3/4 of these trees being 18 inches in diameter or more, yet only, again, around 1 in 5, 22% of the street trees are approximately 6 inches or less in diameter. And then here in Massachusetts, we have half of our street trees at 15 inches or more, with over 50% of these being actually 20 inches or greater. So again, my earlier point about the fact that we don't have a plethora, the preponderance of our street trees being young and up and coming, if you will, or mature, and we have much more of our trees being sort of in that middle to larger bracket where they're mature and indeed starting to decline. It sort of explains the need for this age diversity, if you will, but we also need diversity at also the species and genus level. Basically, this is a shot from New York from Dr. Fred Callett. He works with Dr. Nina Bastick over at the Urban Horticulture Institute, and they've done a lot of great research on this sort of thing. So basically, if you look at the state population dynamics in New York of our urban street trees, we're dealing with 44% of them being maple trees. So we look here in Massachusetts, very similar. We're dealing with about 46% or so being maple trees. And I think this slide, sort of from a visual standpoint, sort of does a nice job of sort of summarizing that. And that is, this is actually from Connecticut, from Dr. Jeff Ward at the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station, where again, you're looking at 48%. So somewhere in the vicinity, upwards of 50% of our street trees in Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. And I have no reason to believe that it's really any different in our other New England states, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. Certainly Kate can correct me on that. But I have no reason to believe it's really a whole lot different in terms of the species diversity that we need to see in our urban environment. So we know that from an age perspective, there are certainly some issues. We're dealing with largely an even age stand of trees in our urban environment, and from a species perspective, that's also the same. So in terms of, as I said before, referencing that study, that Forest Service study, in talking about some of the underlying causes, one of the areas that they delve into a little bit, and this is sort of a nice quote from Dr. Bastick from Cornell, and it relates to development and construction. And according to her, construction-related injury and loss of usable soil space remain among the most important barriers to the health of our urban trees. And they explore that a little bit in the study. And of course, we've got lots of pictures, lots of anecdotes, lots of personal experience with these sorts of pictures that we're looking at, like right here, for example, where probably the most popular place to park something of mass, something of girth is underneath a tree. And of course, we all know the problems with this sort of thing. You know, this picture in and of itself, it is problematic because of the fact that tree roots are found largely near the surface of the soil, and they grow very wide in terms of the proximity from the actual bole of the tree. So there's just a few statistics that we've all seen these sorts of things before, but we know that if you were to stand at the center of the tree and walk to the edge of the canopy of a typical tree, you could actually continue another 2 to 3 times in distance and still find roots from that particular tree in many situations. That's going to vary based on the tree species and based on soil conditions and those sorts of things, but this is a good rule of thumb. One of the older rules of thumb come from an early study in the early 1980s, where twice the height of the tree is sort of, again, a rule of thumb used to identify how far roots spread from the actual tree itself. And again, as I said before, roots do not typically grow that deep. You find nearly all of your roots in the top 3 feet of the soil, with over 50% of those being in the top 18 to 12 inches of the soil. So roots do not grow terribly deep. These are actually pictures down in the New York metro area that I took last fall after Sandy, and it sort of epitomizes what I'm saying in that, you know, you look at these root plates and you just don't see the depth beyond really 3 feet or so of root penetration. So it sort of takes us back to what we were talking about here with this particular shot that I took on the property. And this is, of course, an excavator next to a Corcus velutina. This is black oak. And so we were doing actually an assessment on this particular property. And I remember the individual that we were working with on this site, we were doing a consultation, was trying to convince us that this tree was perfectly healthy because there was green leaf cover in the canopy. Now, anyone who has any sort of experience looking up at a tree will actually know that this is actually a pretty thin canopy. You see a fair amount of dead wood up in the canopy. Leaves are smaller themselves, and there's just a lot less leaf cover. So as Dr. Gary Watson says from the Morton Arboretum in the Midwest, on most landscapes, in landscape situations, 80% of plant problems, and those are the problems that you and I note above ground, are as a result of something that's going on below ground. So something like this can cause something like this, certainly down the road. So we started looking around this particular tree on this property. This was a large 80-foot tall black oak, and we started to dig away around the base of this particular tree. And you can actually see here, it's almost a lip that we're looking at, where the bark suddenly ends, and there's this gap right underneath the bark, and you can see, of course, we've dug away a little bit there. And so what had happened on this site is there's been construction going on for several years. Several inches of topsoil have been brought in and placed around different areas on this property, including around the base of this particular tree. And so what had happened was the bark had actually decayed, and so there was basically a successful ring all the way around this tree of decay. And you can see how we had sort of just did a little bit of digging around the base of the particular tree. And we actually had a chisel there, and we started chiseling away on some spots on that tree that did not look sound. And you can see here, of course, this wood would be what we would simply call punky wood. This wood's had a lot of the lignin removed from it, and so we were able to send that for a lab analysis. And between that, and this is a very helpful field book. I recommend that folks that work with urban trees get this book. I mean, I've had a chance to take a look at a lot of books over the years, and this is definitely one that's really come up time and time again in terms of its use and in terms of its value. This is Wood Decay Fungi by Dr. Chris Luley. And this was diagnosed as being the decay agent in this particular site was hen of the woods. And it's not that was necessarily the death knell of the tree, but it's the fact that the cultural conditions around this tree had changed such that the soil being brought in, the increased moisture, all the decay and such, sort of made way for this particular decay agent to move in. And we know that that Velutina, the Corpus Velutina, is not very decay resistant. So we know that with this particular tree, that is not a good thing. And quite frankly, having a ring of decay around the base of the tree, if you think of how a lever works, there's a lot of weight down there. And so for the long term, I cannot imagine something like that being a good thing. So one of the things that I often recommend that people should have, whether you're on a shade tree committee, whether you're an actual urban forester, or whether you're actually a practicing arborist, is some guidelines related to how far we should be keeping our activities from our urban trees, from the base of these trees, or the canopy of these trees. And this is actually a little bit of an older publication. This is also another popular publication that I've drawn upon many times over the years. This is by Dr. Gary Johnson at the University of Minnesota. It's called Protecting Trees from Construction Damage. And while it's titled The Homeowner's Guide, there's a lot of great, yet easy-to-read technical information in there. And so he talks about a protected root zone, a PRZ or PRZ, the critical root radius, and establishing this using the size of the stem of the tree. So the formula that he uses, and you'll see this in other publications too, is to take the diameter or breast height of the tree, multiply that by a factor of 1 if the tree's younger and more tolerant of construction activity, construction injury, that sort of thing, or multiply that by 1.5 if you wanted to remain at a radius a little bit farther away from the tree if it's older or more sensitive to construction injury, and express that distance in feet, express that radial distance in feet. So in other words, if you had a tree that was 10 inches in diameter, you'd want to remain, in essence, a radius away from the stem of that tree, anywhere from 10 if it were a younger tree, or perhaps 15 if it were an older tree or a tree that's more sensitive to construction injury. 10 to 15 feet would be the radius that you want to remain away from. So it's a great resource that's available on the web. So if you actually Google this particular booklet, you will be able to access it. The one thing I do want to mention is it's a little bit of an older publication. This is, I believe, a 1999 publication. So it is starting to get a little bit dated. But I think, quite frankly, in the urban environment, we see so many times that rule of staying away from the base of a tree being violated, that if we can get people even thinking about these, root protection zones and critical root radius and such, I think we're doing something. Much less the perhaps the small details that have changed from the 1999 publication that Johnson put out to this particular publication, which is a great publication also, and he was part of writing this publication. This is the part of the ANSI standard. This is part of the best management practices that's basically the compendium to the ANSI A300 standards, and this pertains, of course, to managing trees during construction. It's a little bit more of a comprehensive booklet. It's a 2009 publication, I believe, so we're looking at kind of a 10-year update of that last publication I referenced. Now, this publication, the one barrier to getting this publication is it is going to cost some money. It's not terribly cost prohibitive, but these little BMP guides from ISA are usually somewhere in the vicinity of $10 to $15. So if you don't mind spending a little bit of money, you can get something like this. Most of these publications are somewhere in the vicinity of 24 pages. They're generally a fairly easy read. You can see here to the right that the terminology, some of the terminology that they use is a little bit different in the sense that that it's just expressed differently. They call things tree protection zones instead of, we can just go, I can't go back there, but that's okay. They call things tree protection zones instead of protected root zones, and critical root radius, critical root zone instead of critical root radius. So it's basically the same, very same principle in the sense that you identify the diameter at breast height of the tree, and then you multiply that by a factor, that remains in inches. You multiply it simply by a factor of 6 to 18. So again, if you had a tree that was approximately 10 inches in diameter, you'd want to remain at a radius anywhere from 60 to 180 inches or 5 to 15 feet away from that tree. So, and that's a little bit of an adjustable number as well. So that's actually a great resource, and the nice thing about it too is that basically there's more detail in there relating to different types of mulches that can be used and trunk protection guidelines and those sorts of things. So it's a nice comprehensive resource. Okay, so we see we have our second half of the presentation up here. So what I wanted to also talk about relating to construction activities in the urban environment, of course, is this issue with compaction. This is a site that we visited and consulted upon. You can see this beautiful array of sugar maples, and you can actually see on the picture to my top right, so it should be your top right as well, with the single tree without the fence, so the top right of the page. If you look closely at the soil, you can actually see tread marks, from the caterpillar treads from presumably an excavator or some sort of heavy equipment. So what had happened at this site was the landscape architect had called us in. She was worried about the state of these trees because so much activity had taken place around. This was back from the summer of 2010. So if we actually try to remember what weather conditions were like back in the summer of 2010, we remember that to be basically the sort of in competition with the summer of 2012 for the hottest summer on record. And one of the things that was very different about the summer of 2010 compared to the summer of 2012 is that we received very little rainfall here in the Northeast for the most part. Certainly rainfall can be a little bit haphazard, and certain areas can receive more than others, of course, but we received very little rainfall. So at a very stressful point in these trees' lives in terms of climate conditions, what had happened was the soil had been basically compacted. Now, we're all familiar with the term compaction. You think of a typical path, a footpath. Many people think a footpath exists because, we kick the grass off or there's some sort of surface abrasion that removes the plant material. And that's true to a degree, but it's not the real reason. The real reason we have a footpath is because of surface compaction, where the upper few inches of the soil become so compacted it becomes inhospitable for the roots of, say, for example, grass. In a situation like this, where you have large machines moving over a site, we're talking about something much larger in terms of its volume compared to, say, a person. Not that we can't compact by walking. Again, I use the footpath analogy. But when you're dealing with something with a much larger volume, you can run into something called subsurface compaction. So surface compaction would be like sort of compacting your quilt on top of your bed. Subsurface compaction would be like flattening not only the quilt, but the whole mattress and all of that damage that ensues from that. Now, you can imagine that can be quite devastating. Certainly on a plant-by-plant basis, as I've said before, trees can tolerate disturbance, construction disturbance to varying degrees. But one sort of category of plants that's notoriously sensitive to construction injury in the urban environment are our climax species. And so if you remember, I said before, this is a little allay of sugar maple. Well, sugar maple are sort of that quintessential climax species where they like to move into an area and they want to anchor into that area for preferably hundreds of years. They don't want a lot of change going on. So when we go and drive over an area with a caterpillar or some sort of heavy equipment, this is absolutely not the type of tree to be doing it by. Additionally, you think about the summer conditions and what trees are doing in a very hot summer like the summer of 2010. This was absolutely not the summer to be doing this sort of thing. So this is sort of absolutely something that is very detrimental to the health of our trees. And so one of the tools that I recommend is that people get something called a soil penetrometer. Now this is a binary tool. It's nothing incredibly fancy, but what it does is it allows you to go out and poke around, and you can actually, there's a needle on the bottom and a gauge on the top, and you can actually see the red part of the gauge on top. There are two sizes of needles. So the larger needle, which would be used on the top part of the gauge, the smaller needle is a half-inch, larger needle being 3/4 of an inch. So let's say, for example, if you're staring at this gauge on the top right-hand side and you had your half-inch needle on, once that you would push into the soil, it would measure the force, pounds per square inch, and once that needle hit, once your needle on the gauge hit the red in the actual gauge, once that needle moved up to the red, that in theory is when roots can no longer penetrate the soil. So it's sort of a resistance type of a meter, if you will, the soil penetrometer. It gives you a nice binary reading. It allows you to go out and very quickly determine how deep you can penetrate into the soil, and then at least in theory, how far roots can penetrate. It's only $250. It's a great tool that I recommend anybody get because, again, it's sort of a little bit of a third-party opinion on the state of the soil, if you will. So when we talked about construction-related injury as it relates to this sort of issue of development and construction and how that impacts the health of our urban trees, the other kind of part of that statement is the loss of usable soil space. So we'll talk a little bit about that now because the two are very related. And of course, we know that trees, one of the key limiting factors to trees and tree size in the urban environment is available soil. And of course, we can see on the left-hand side here on the top with our honey locust trees, our Gladitia triacanthos, we can actually see that the larger trees in the left-hand side of the slide have successfully broken through into that grassy area on the far left of the bottom of the slide, whereas those trees planted in the street pits on the right-hand side are very small, they don't look very healthy, and they don't look like they're really going to get that big. It's going to take them a lot longer to get anywhere near the same size as their brethren on the left-hand side of the screen. And same sort of deal on the bottom with these willow oak, with the Quercus fellows, where you can see these trees planted in these lawns have done and are continuing to do much better on the right-hand side versus the ones, again, in the street pits on the left. Now, it's interesting, right, when they open up these tree pits, and you see the way that roots grow and respond. This directional growth on the left is called plagiotropic growth, where roots, of course, can actually change direction wholesale, which is pretty neat in of itself. You got to have that sort of appreciation for that sort of thing. And then, of course, you can see on the right-hand side, you can actually see how that root is sort of flattened out to try to expose that interface between the concrete and then the hard pack beneath. That's always really neat to see. So the question is, how much space is enough? Well, if you think about the fact that our average street tree lives somewhere in the vicinity of about 10 years, and we know, of course, that that's a fraction of its potential because trees themselves live in a very long time. I think of even pioneer species like our birches and our cherries and such living, having our lifespan, 60 to 100 years, if you will. You think about that compared to the 10 years that we get out of them in the downtown urban core in those pit-type environments. We're certainly not finding them enough space with some of our little more traditional practices, even some of our current practices today. But the numbers are sort of all over the board, if you will, in terms of looking at some of the research, and we've in essence landed on this figure at the bottom, 2 cubic feet of usable soil space per square foot of deciduous canopy. Now, what do we mean when we say 2 cubic feet of usable soil space per square foot of deciduous canopy? Well, you basically think of how we used to draw trees when we were children. You think of us drawing a lollipop, if you will, and the lollipop would cast the shade of a circle. You sort of calculate, we're talking about that square footage of canopy cover being calculated like a circle, if you will. And there's a whole set of equations that we could have another talk, Kate, and go through this another time about calculating how much space urban trees need and how much space you have and how big a tree will get in that particular space using this 2 cubic foot kind of rule of thumb per square foot of deciduous canopy. And we've certainly tried, I call these kind of local modifications on site in terms of these tree pits. We've tried to, especially over the years, modify and create as much space as possible, and that's absolutely a good thing. And then, of course, we're fortunate here in Massachusetts through Chapter 87, our laws, that we can actually, the state can actually, municipalities can actually plant trees on private properties, generally about 20 feet back from the right-of-way. So basically, you have these types of open lawn plantings in areas where the municipal tree manager is sort of aware and savvy about this particular mandate being permitted to them. So this is ideal, again, because, again, you've got more of that usable soil space compared to some of those traditional type of pits and such. And, of course, we've done a lot underneath the hard pan, if you will, in those urban environments. Certainly I've spoken with and seen plans where different types of piping systems have been used under sidewalks and such to, again, try to facilitate root movement and allow roots to move into a breakout zone like you saw in some of those earlier pictures. And then, of course, this is the Silvacell system. This is Jim Urban's system, where they have it's called the suspended pavement system, where basically you have these structures, and you sort of see them on the right-hand side, this deck frame type system, where they're basically these structures that are in essence largely void space, and you would bring in soil to whatever your specifications would be, and you basically fill these deck frame systems, the suspended pavement system, the Silvacells, and that soil is then in theory exploited by the trees to get large and to get healthy and to grow well. And of course you can see on the left hand side here just these being used here in Pittsburgh. You could just again, you could search the Silvacell system and read lots about it. So it's being used here in Pittsburgh. I know it's used in the Pacific Northwest and other select areas throughout the country. It is fairly expensive. You think of $250 per cubic foot, and I've talked to some other urban foresters and tree wardens here in Massachusetts, and that is definitely a barrier with this system. So it's certainly great. It's certainly a great system, and with really great potential to change the way that urban trees grow. But because of the cost and a couple of other things, you think of, again, you're really not probably going to be installing this in select little areas. It's probably going to be in kind of a new construction type site where you're going to have larger, more prominent specimen trees, that sort of thing, because of, again, the cost associated with that. So, but it is used in select cities, and really it is a great system with lots of great positives. And this is a little bit more of a commonly used system. This is, of course, we have really a whole lot of engineered soils available now. This is sort of the progenitor to that. This is our Cornell structural soil, where basically you have the trees being planted into a crushed stone type setting, where these crushed stones have been covered in a clay loam-based soil. So you have some soil there, about a 20% clay loam-based soil mixture with a hydrogel binding agent, and this particular type system is used. As you can actually see here, the stones themselves sort of create the lattice work for the weight to sort of bear the load of the compaction needed for the sidewalks and such that you require in an urban environment. So you can see here the roots on the left from a tree. This is from some of the earlier trials of trees being planted in the Cornell structural soil versus something, again, in the conventional type street tree type planting where soils, of course, are very, very compacted. So our engineered soils are sort of another way where people are sort of working around what or addressing this need for more space in the urban environment. They too, just as the silvocell system has its challenges, have their challenges. You know, you hear about different types of trees performing better than other types of trees in engineered soil. So there could be some species variation. You know, these systems are fairly new in and of themselves. You think of something that's kind of been around for 15, 20 years like these systems, it's not a lot of time. So really time will tell to see how often and how frequent engineered soils and silvocells and such will make their way into the urban environment. But it is interesting to learn about them and how they are helpful in terms of increasing usable soil space. And of course, the other topic that our study touches on is the all-important topic of invasive insects. And we'll go through this fairly quickly because we know, of course, we've heard lots about the costs associated with invasive insects, lots about things like Asian longhorn beetle. We have the largest, in terms of numbers of trees that have been taken down, Worcester is the largest site in the country. Now, it's not the largest site in terms of area that's being affected, but over 23,500 trees have been removed in Worcester, Massachusetts. So we certainly know the risks associated with our trees. And again, this speaks to the need for urban diversity because we know the preference of our deciduous trees, like maple trees that Asian longhorn beetle has. This is just a pre and then a post shot in the same area in Worcester, Mass. from the removal efforts of Asian longhorn beetle. And of course, here we have new finds coming all the time here in New England from emerald ash borer. We just did our second positive find here in Massachusetts really recently. And so we know that we worry about this insect and how this insect threatens the real existence of our ash trees here in the U.S. And then of course we look at something like our eastern hemlock, one of our keystone forest species that's also used in the urban environment as specimen plantings and as hedge plantings and such. And the challenge that this particular tree's had with invasive insects, not the least of which is Hemlock woolly Adelgid. And we know, of course, this is actually unofficially the diagnostic form that was responsible for the first submission of this insect in New York State, as the insect was making its way north through New York and up through, of course, New England. This was back, and you can actually see in the middle of the page to the right-hand side that it was received on campus in Ithaca on December the 4th, 1985. And in the middle of the page, my friend Tom Kowalczyk, the diagnostician out in Long Island, was sending this to Carolyn Class, the on-campus entomologist at the time. Both Tom and Carolyn have retired since then. And Tom writes to Carolyn, these appear to be Adelgids right in the center of the page. I thought that it may be significant since they're on hemlock. This insect has been responsible for the obliteration of about 60% of the hemlock trees in the state of New Jersey. So indeed, significant is a good word. And of course, we can see when we flip over the needles, the white cottony masses that the insect actually lives in. And there's a little bit of information about the actual insect itself. It's a very small insect. It was found in the early 1950s in Richmond, Virginia, in a private plant collection, and really has sort of spread from that vicinity since. And then, of course, some of the early suppositions that it made its way to New York, New England in the early mid-1980 years on Hurricane Gloria. I've heard other specialists say that's not so. Either way, it did make its way up here. That makes me think in the back of my mind, what the heck did Sandy move around last year? But I suppose that's another topic for another time. But we know that successful infestation with Hemlock woolly Adelgid will eventually lead to death of your typical of the vast majority of hemlock trees that it infests. And of course, we've seen the range, as I said, increase dramatically over the years. And this, of course, is the life cycle of the insect. We're basically at this particular time of the year, so around Christmas time here, we sort of see that the insects have broken estivation, which means that they're actively feeding. If you see on the right-hand side near October, so they're now actively feeding and maturing. And that's one of the unique abilities that this insect has. It's sort of active and feeding and developing its key generation, this winter generation, when really not a whole lot else is happening in the environment. So it really is a huge benefit to this particular insect, because you think about threats from things like beneficials. Well, there isn't a whole lot of beneficial activity out there right now because of temperatures and time of the year and such. This is actually a close-up right here, and you can see the spiracles on either side of the body of this insect. Insects breathe, Hemlock woolly adelgid insects in general breathe like a billows type system, contracting and expanding their muscle tissue and simply pulling air directly out of the environment through these small ports, if you will. And this, of course, is your typical environment that you would find hemlocks planted in, or grown in, and on the right-hand side, planted in the urban environment. And we've been working actually for the last 10 years. If anybody's interested in more information, we've been working for the last 10 years on Chinese hemlock. It's been found to be entirely resistant to Hemlock woolly adelgid, and so I believe it's got great potential as a surrogate planting, as a replacement planting in urban environments where at one time we're trying to grow a hemlock hedge, but now, of course, we're married to some sort of insecticide program, or that hedge has since succumbed to Hemlock woolly adelgid. We don't have a lot of conifers that we plant in the environment. The benefits of conifers are very numerous because of the fact they have foliage year-round. So this is something that I think definitely deserves further exploration and something that we're actively looking into. And so this is another invasive insect that, of course, threatens many of our conifers, elongate hemlock scale. Very pernicious insect. So our trees are certainly not without challenge in this particular area. But I think sort of to wrap up, if you will, we need to kind of give our current practices an honest examination, how that relates to trees and how well trees are doing in terms of lifespan and performance in the urban environment. And we seem to have this perpetual problem, if you look at the bottom of this particular tree, where it comes to some sort of matter, whether it's soil, whether it's mulch, some sort of matter that is placed on top of the root system of plants. We know that's not that's not in line with what the standards are, with what the AMC standards are that I've listed below, but that's the sheer reality. And of course, I'm a huge proponent of not using shredded mulch. Shredded mulch, I've found over the years, I have never seen anything written about this, but I've always found that shredded mulch knits together, sort of forming this cake-like barrier, if you will, this hydrophobic barrier, where it definitely interrupts the penetration of water into the deeper areas that are needed to the root system of the tree. So not only, of course, must we not volcano mulch. We've all heard about that, and I think we've all heard about that ad nauseum. But types of mulch, I'm a huge proponent of using nugget mulch or something like that won't necessarily knit together like this. And then we just kind of proceed further underground, and we see that this excess soil problem below the mulch is a huge issue. You can see here in this particular picture, this tree on the top left-hand side at 10 inches, almost a foot of extra soil on top of the root system, and we know that that's going to affect the way the trees grow after they've been planted, and the formation of things like girdling roots, the susceptibility to pests, and those sorts of challenges. And we can see actually this picture here on the left-hand side, that gap that we've all seen so many times if we see trees planted in the urban environment, where we've seen too much mulch and too much soil on top of the root system. And you know, different parties get into blaming each other. You have arborists blaming the production folks, and nursery folks blaming the arborists for poor installation, and it just kind of goes back and forth. But I think that, quite honestly, it's something that wherever it happens, it can definitely be remedied at the site of plants, and there's plenty of responsibility that we can all share in making the situation better. And again, you can see here, checking for the flare. This is something that there's actually standards to do this. You know, people often say, well, reject trees, but there's not a whole lot of follow-up given in terms of the standards by which to do that. And this is actually from Dr. Gary Watson at the Morton Arboretum. And so what his work says is that you should be able to find, you can poke around with something like this is a chaining pin, or you poke around with a wire, or you could even use something like a penetrometer, quite frankly, where you'd be poking around. You should find 2 or 3 structural roots within 1 to 3 inches of the soil surface, 3 to 4 inches from the stem of the tree. The rule of thumb that I have used for years is 3-3-3, where, as I said, you should be able to find around 3 structural roots within 3 inches of the soil surface, so they shouldn't have more than 3 inches of soil on them, 3 inches or more from the stem of the tree. 3, 3, 3. That's sort of the rule of thumb that I've used over the years. And of course, planting higher is one way of trying to address something like this. Another way I've seen here in Massachusetts and the commercial folks I used to work with in New York is that a lot of arborists and urban foresters are using the tool spade in sort of this little bit of a unique way, innovative way, and that is they're blasting off the parent soil that comes with these trees. And as I said before, sometimes in these situations you have too much soil already on top of the roots from the point of delivery. This is being removed, and these trees are basically being treated like bare root trees. So they're being actually bare rooted into the site. So that's something that I've definitely seen. So I'm going to close with just a couple of anecdotes to sort of drive home what I'm talking about here. This is a site that we were called into. This is down in New York City. This was an area where a park was being established. It was once I believe it was a parking area or a road. So they brought in a whole bunch of engineered soil, and a lot of resources have been committed to this. You can see this tree on the right-hand side that's leaning over that's already dead. These trees were planted in 2 different swaths. They were planted once in late April, and then once again a few weeks later in June. And so we were there in July. So they're planted in 2 different intervals. You can actually see there was a pretty large tree. These were pretty large trees when they were planted. These trees were actually about 5 to 6 inches in caliper. You measure a new tree at the caliper point. They were 5 to 6 inches in caliper, which is about this. In this particular case, it's measured a foot above the soil base of the tree, at the base of the tree, because it's 4 inches or larger. So that's how you're measuring these trees. And this is my chaining pin. Chaining pin's about 18 inches in length, and I've laid it across to get an estimation of the diameter of the tree root ball. So according to the nursery standards, you should have approximately 10 inches of root diameter per inch of tree caliper, per tree caliper inch. So if we're dealing with a tree that's 5 to 6 inches, I should have 50 to 60 inches or upwards of 4 to 5 feet of a root diameter. This diameter is about 22 inches or so. So you could basically see that these trees were basically dead at the point where they were dug because they didn't have enough root mass that was actually taken with them. Now, in this particular site, I had mentioned that they put a lot of resources into it. What they'd actually done is they'd actually flown the landscape architect to North Carolina to actually pick out these trees. So if you think about the carbon benefits of trees, I'm not sure moving them from North Carolina to New York City is sort of nixes all that benefit. But whenever they die right away, it certainly does. And they basically died at the point where they were dug, much less before the after the transport. So that's what had happened in this particular site, and we're seeing this to some degree or other more and more. You could also see some adventitious roots have been formed here too with these particular trees. So just kind of a couple common problems that we have with trees in terms of trying to institute some sort of quality control before drop-off, if that's at all possible. And my last little story here, this is actually Lagerstroma. This is crepe myrtle, and of course crepe myrtle are beautiful and they flower throughout the summer on new wood. This is actually a picture from the 28th story overlooking Central Park, and then the landscape architect had called us to this particular site because the crepe myrtles weren't blooming anymore. And what had happened with these particular plants was, well, you know, it relates back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of usable space. These plants had basically used up the space that was available to them in the planters, and they couldn't put on any more new growth. So if they couldn't put on any more new growth, they could no longer flower. Additionally, you can actually see all those fine roots there just past my index finger. Those fine roots are there because these trees are being watered a lot. Crepe myrtle do not need that sort of water. They're very much a sandy kind of dry soil type tree. And you can actually see my chaining pin where I was poking around, and you can see that it's much deeper than it should be. So they definitely violated the 3-3-3 rule. I couldn't find three roots at a distance of about 3 inches from the base of the tree with no more than 3 inches of soil on top of them. It was much deeper. So certainly there was a quality control issue here at the establishment. And if you get a chance, go get yourself some chaining pins. They're pretty cheap through Gemplers and forestry suppliers, and they're great for doing this sort of thing. So nice quote from the U.S. Forest Service chief. It's nice to see that urban forests are getting their proper due in terms of They're important, and that's making it, in essence, all the way to the top of the food chain. And if anybody gets a chance, feel free to come down and see us at Stockbridge Hall here at UMASS in Amherst in the spring. You're welcome to come to our day-long annual Spring Tree Conference. And there's actually a monthly publication that the Department of Conservation and Recreation, our good partners, Molly Freilischer is one of our urban foresters here in the States. Just send her a note if you want to read more about some of the things I talked about tonight. I write regularly for the Citizen Forester. And so I see that I've taken us right to the 8 o'clock time period. So if there are any questions, I can try to answer some. But if you have to run, that's fine too. I know we did start a couple minutes past 7, so I don't feel too bad.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. So we do have a question from Amalia. She was asking about the comment that you made about the mulch, and I'm actually interested in that myself. And I hadn't heard the comment that you made about not using shredded mulch.
Kate, are you touching your microphone? I just hear lots of static. I couldn't hear you.
Sorry about
actually.
that. Can you hear me now?
That's okay. It's
yeah,
about
so
mulch,
the question was
right?
about mulch, and you had made a comment about not using shredded mulch and recommended nugget mulch instead. Can you talk just?
That's what I've often recommended as a just because I've seen the shredded mulch knit together so much and form that hydrophobic barrier.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that, and one thing that we do recommend for communities is to pull back the mulch, after the second year. So before you apply new mulch, to try to pull back any of the old shredded bark mulch. Now, when you say nugget mulch, are you talking like wood chips or
like a pine bark mulch, pine bark nuggets?
Okay.
That sort of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Let's see here. I'm just trying to find that slide. Oops. We have too many chefs spoiling the broth here. Okay, should be, there we go. So you can see on the right-hand side there, that's that finely shredded mulch that I'm talking about. And you can see how that knits together.
And another question from Amalia about where did you get it? And I'm not sure. Are you asking Amalia about where you could find nugget mulch? Okay, yes.
Yeah, so that's real common. I mean, if you go to buy any sort of mulch, you'll see all sorts of sizes and colors. But yeah, so you can get in. Like I said, I always get like a conifer, like a chunk type conifer type mulch that does me fine. Now you can use shredded bark mulch, but you got to be out there, and like you're saying, Kate, you kind of have to be a little bit fastidious about working it in and turning it and just kind of not letting it settle in on itself, and kind of, like I said, it just kind of notoriously knits together and forms that hydrophobic barrier.
Yep, that's a great point, Rick. And as I was saying, the places that I've seen that most common are when it's just applied year after year, and nobody's going through and clearing away the old mulch. But you're right. If it does compact, it certainly can prevent water from penetrating through and can create issues. So.
Absolutely, I would love to. That would be an awesome thing to study, but only I don't know. I think people tease us for saying things like that. They call it geek stuff, don't they?
Well, let's see here. It looks like we have one more question coming in from Candace. So I'll give her a second here. Oh, okay. Just well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate you joining us tonight, and it's so interesting to see all the research that's been done, and certainly I love the way you tie it back to how we can make changes on the ground and create healthier trees. So thank you so much again for joining us. Just a reminder to folks, we do have an evaluation of tonight's webinar, and we do appreciate you taking the time to give us your feedback. So you can go ahead and here we go. There's on the screen there should be a link to the to the SurveyMonkey, and the link is also available in the chat box. So if you don't mind, please follow that link and take the survey. And then just a quick reminder, Rick talked a little bit about wood decay fungi, and there was a great segue next up in January, actually on January 15th. the next webinar is going to be fun with wood decay fungi. So we'll have Isabel Munick from the USDA Forest Service joining us to talk a little bit more about wood decay and have some fun with it. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us this evening, and thank you again, Rick, for taking the time. And just a quick shout out, thank you so much. Behind the scenes, making everything work tonight is Lucy from UVM Extension, and I just want to thank her as well for her assistance. So with that, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Happy holidays, and have a good evening.